Thank you, Mr. President, Eminences, Excellencies, academicians, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Grazie. Questa. Migration is an ancient human adaptation. Viewed anthropologically, migration is written in our genome and encoded in our bodies, in our bipedalism, in our stereoscopic vision, in our nervous system. Migration is constitutive of the human experience. Modern humans are the children of immigration. While human migrations antecede nations and states by millennia, in a number of modern nation states, Argentina, Australia, Canada, the United States, immigration is at the center of the narrative of how the nation came to be in its present form. In the modern era, migrations are complex, multi-determined, and escape vulgar mechanistic models of causality. Migrations unfold in complex ecologies, involving broad features of the state, qua sovereignty, borders, demography, economy, and society. Furthermore, historical relations, cultural affinities, political interests, and the environment itself continue to carve the pathways of the great human migrations in the new millennium. All continents today are involved in the massive movements of people as areas of immigration, emigration, transit, and return, and often all four at once. In the 21st century, migration is the human face of globalization. The sounds, the colors of a miniaturized, interconnected, and ever-fragile world. Migration is indeed a shared condition of all humanity. International migration has grown rapidly since the turn of the millennium. According to the most recent data, the number of international migrants worldwide reached over 258 million in 2017, up from 220 million in 2010. In 2017, 67% of all international migrants were living in 20 nation states. The largest international corridors of human migration are in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The largest number of international migrants in the world is in the United States, 50 million, Saudi Arabia, Germany, the Russian Federation hosted the second, third, and fourth largest numbers of migrants worldwide, approximately 12 million each, followed by the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland with nearly 9 million. In 2017, India was the largest country of origin of international immigrants, 17 million, followed by Mexico, 13 million, other countries of origin with large immigrant populations include the Russian Federation, China, Bangladesh, Syrian Arab Republic, Pakistan, and the Ukraine. Today, women comprise slightly less than half of all international migrants. In Europe, female migrants outnumber male migrants. Migration involves a change of residence and a change in community. Scholarly research has specialized in two broad types of large-scale migration: internal migration within the confines of the nation state and international migration across international borders. Although the large-scale movements of people within the nation state is a phenomenon of a separate order from mass migrations across international borders, internal migrants often share many characteristics with international migrants. Most move from rural villages to urban centers. Many experience linguistic and cultural dislocations, racialization, and face isomorphic bureaucratic and legal restrictions. Much scholarly and policy attention has been focused on international migration, yet most migrants are internal migrants staying within the confines of their nation states. International migration has also, internal migration has also been on the rise, with an estimated number of internal migrants today at over 763 million. In this lecture, I first introduced the most up-to-date relevant data on human migration and examine the broad features of a conceptual model framing migration in the current era of globalization. Second, I turn to a new cartography of mass migrations flowing from unchecked climate change, environmental degradation, war, and terror. Finally, I offer a humanitarian reflection on responses to this defining existential crisis of our times. While in terms of sheer numbers, more people are now on the move than ever before, the rate of international migration has remained rather stable over the last 50 years, with roughly 2.5 to 3.3% of the world's population living beyond their country of birth. Globalization's 3 M's: markets, their integration and disintegration; media, the new information, communication, and social media technologies; and migration, the movement of people on a planetary scale, challenge the deep structures of the nation state and interrupt the taken for granted Herderian ideals and longings for alignment, coherence, qua language, identity, region, or territory, and das Volkgeist. Globalization increases inequality and emerges as a multiplier of mass migration in a variety of very, very powerful ways. First, the integration and disintegration of markets stimulate migration because where capital flows, immigrants will follow. Second, new information, communication, and media technologies enable the post-nationalization of production and stimulate migration by producing new structures of desire, tastes, and consumption practices. Third, globally integrated economies, especially in the high and middle income countries in the world, are structured around a predilection for foreign workers, both in the knowledge-intensive sectors of the economy as well as in the least desirable sectors. Fourth, the affordability of mass transportation puts the option of migration within the reach of millions who heretofore could not afford to do so. Fifth, globalization stimulates new migration because it continues to produce uneven results. Wage differentials, when control for cost of living differences, continue to grow in all of the best traveled south-north migration corridors. Globalization weakens the traditional structures and strictures of the nation state. Demographic and environmental factors examined below also play a decisive role in the dystopic migrations of the 21st century, today, and moving forward. There are disparate motivations and pathways for migration, yet large-scale migration is never random. It is ignited and gathers momentum along predictable corridors. At the proximate level, migration is a strategy of the household. Distinct patterns of kinship, household, and social organization carve the pathways for worldwide migratory journeys. The fundamental unit of migration is the family, variously defined and structured by distinct culturally coded, religious, legislative, economic, reproductive, and symbolic forms. At the distal level, migration is multiply determined by labor markets, wage differentials, demographic imbalances, technological, and climate change. However, up close, it is the family that makes migration work. Migration typically starts with the family, and family bonds sustain it. Migration profoundly changes the family. Love and work are useful to think about migration as an adaptation of and for the family. Historically, the clash of powerful nation-states was the main driver of involuntary displacement of mass populations. In the modern era, 2 world wars, the wars of colonial liberation, the Cold War, pushed millions to seek shelter in safer lands. By the end of World War II, Europe had more than 40 million refugees, then the largest number in recorded history. The Second World War had another indirect impact on mass migration. For example, the entrance of the United States into the war led to the creation of a guest worker program to recruit temporary Mexican braceros to labor in US fields. Over half a century, that temporary program led to the largest flow of immigrants in recorded US history. Likewise, the various temporary guest worker programs in Europe ended up delivering permanent immigrant communities now visible in Berlin, Brussels, Rotterdam, and elsewhere. Decolonialization and the wars of liberation generated their own refugee routes, sending the Congolese to Belgium, Maghrebians to France, Indonesians to the Netherlands. The colonial struggles for independence in Africa, from the Maghreb to South Africa, Asia, including the end of the British Raj and the subsequent partition of the subcontinent, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, in its various proxy wars in Africa, Asia, the Americas, created massive displacements of people. The eminent academician of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, Professor Ramanathan, has argued that unchecked climate change and geophysical hazards increase morbidity and mortality, disrupt production, decrease agricultural yields, disseminate livestock, and forcefully displace millions the world over. According to the Global Report on Internal Displacement, over the past 8 years, over 203 million displacements have been recorded, an average of 25 million each year. The majority of these new displacements occurred in low and lower middle-income countries as a result of large-scale weather events, and had predominantly occurred in South and East Asia. Slow onset, existing vulnerabilities, and conflict continue to converge into explosive tipping points for displacement. To understand Syria, it's best to look at NASA data. It is a country experiencing the worst drought in over 800 years. The worst drought in over 800 years. The most recent data suggests a continuing alarming trend. There were 18.8 million new internal displacements associated with disasters across 135 countries. Weather-related hazards triggered the vast majority of new displacements, with floods accounting for 8.6 million new displacements, and storms, mainly tropical cyclones, 7.5 million. After holding for 3/4 of a century, the map tracing the major global migration corridors of the post-World War era have become increasingly blurred. 3 disparate formations lay the foundations for an emerging new cartography. First, the dismemberment of the Soviet Union and the Cold War significantly impacted the acceleration of human migrations. Second, the worldwide economic crisis of 2008 and the anti-government uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East, beginning in 2010, the so-called Arab Spring, signal another turning point. Third, President Trump's move to make good on the campaign promises that elected him, rapidly stepping up the deportations of unauthorized immigrants in the United States, building a 2,000-mile concrete wall along the Mexican border, halting Syrian and other refugees from entering the United States, marked a brusque turning point in the global migration landscape. In the same vein, Brexit and the current rise of nativistic anti-immigrant movements in Europe and elsewhere marks the beginning of an entirely new cartography of mass migrations. Mass migrations are increasingly defined by the slow-motion disintegration of failing states with feeble institutions, war and terror, unchecked climate change, and demographic imbalances. Symbiotically, these forces are the new drivers of the catastrophic migrations of the 21st century. In the first quarter of the century, the world is witnessing the largest number of forcefully displaced human beings in history. While precise numbers are elusive and changing, UN data suggests that more than 68 million people are escaping home into the unknown. The majority of those seeking shelter are internally displaced peoples, not formal refugees across international borders. In addition, approximately 9 in 10 international asylum seekers will remain in a neighboring country. Asians will stay in Asia, Africans in Africa, Americans in the Americas. In the United States, as cross-border migration from Mexico declined at the beginning of this decade, Central Americans began a new exodus north. From 2016 to 2018, the number of families from Honduras and Guatemala apprehended at the southern border almost doubled. rising from over 23,000 to over 50,000 for family units from Guatemala, and from over 20,000 to approximately 40,000 family units in the same period from Honduras. Migration from El Salvador tripled between 2013 and 2016, with more than 27,000 family units and 17,000 unaccompanied children apprehended at the southern border in 2016. Overall, the number of families seeking refuge shot up again, with Border Patrol agents detaining 136,150 children and parents during the first 5 months of this year. There are many reasons for the rapid kinetic expansion of migrants fleeing from the Northern Triangle. In Guatemala, the source of the most recent border crossers, climate change, environmental malfeasance, and land tenure clashes in the Western Highlands continues to engender violence. Furthermore, depressed prices in global markets for Guatemalan commodities are pushing farmers northward. Climate change and severe drought in El Salvador has resulted in food insecurity for millions, while deforestation has left Honduras extremely vulnerable to hurricanes. Hurricane Mitch left more than 11,000 dead and displaced more than 2.5 million Hondurans when it hit, before governments and the media understood the dangers of unchecked climate change, global warming, and environmental malfeasance. According to a study by Brown University School of Medicine, nearly 500,000 adults under age 15 or older living in Honduras experienced post-traumatic stress disorder in the wake of the hurricane. It was then that Hondurans first migrated in significant numbers to the United States. We have a number when the flow begins. The phase of catastrophic migrations in the 21st century is youthful. As the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has taught us, quote, "Children are a sign of hope, a sign of life, but also a diagnostic sign, a marker indicating the health of families, society, and the entire world. Whenever children are accepted, loved, cared for, and protected, the family is healthy, society is more healthy, and the world is more human," end of quote. Crying children are the face of the catastrophic migrations of the 21st century. Worldwide, 1 in every 200 child is now forcibly displaced, almost twice the number of a decade ago. According to UN data, children on the move now are larger than the populations of Canada and Sweden combined. Additionally, millions of children are internal migrants separated from their families. In China alone, a staggering 61 million children were left behind in the countryside as the parents migrate to the coastal cities. In the 21st century, even under the best of circumstances, migrations separate family members and disrupt familiar bonds. To migrate today is to separate families. Globalization and mass migrations are changing the way citizens experience national identities and cultural belongings. The unmaking of the Herderian ideal upsets the symbolic order of the nation, interrupts the taken for granted social practices, reshapes political processes, engenders new cultural identities, and channels new anxieties of long-term citizens. Dystopic migration processes are generating new oppositions, dualities, and hybrids that nation states at this point in history have difficulty managing. The architectures for the protection of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are not geared to the era of failing states and environmental dystopia. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States and its allies developed the policies for refugees based on the assumption that whatever caused them to flee their countries, their homes, would be resolved. Therefore, civilized nations could promise non-refoulement, the right not to be returned to a place of violence or persecution because the promise was temporary. These architectures today are misaligned with new conditions in the field. First, protracted conflicts and devastated environments hold little promise of safe return. The conflicts in the countries generating the greatest numbers of forcefully displaced are protracted. War and terror in Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia have endured longer than World War I and World War II. Second, these architectures are generally blind to the developmental needs of children. Given the growing numbers of forcefully displaced children, this is a topic of extreme urgency, and one I urge our academy to continue studying. Even when temporary protection is possible or desirable, children in flight need more than a safe haven. They need a place to grow up. They need a home. Third, the architectures are misaligned with the best evidence and current thinking on health, mental health, trauma, legal protections, and above all, education. We are in the age of what Alexander Betts, director of the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford, has called survival migration. Millions are fleeing existential threats, but as the Holy Father has taught us, do not meet the standard requirements for refugee status. Millions of people linger in camps far away from the wealthy cities of Asia, Europe, North America, and Australia. Indeed, the world is witnessing what we might call the forced confinement crisis of our era. The majority of forcefully displaced persons will remain within the confines of states or spill over into neighboring nation states. Only 1 in 10 human beings will ever make it to a safe country today. Between and betwixt the structures of the nation states, millions of human beings have been internally displaced. Millions are awaiting asylum. Millions more are living in the shadow of the law as irregular or unauthorized immigrants. Sarah Dryden Peterson at Harvard found that in 33 conflicts globally, the average length of exile today is 25 years. For a Syrian child in a Turkish camp, the odds are that she will spend her entire childhood, adolescence, and emerging adulthood in displacement, in confinement. In this lecture, we first examined the relevant data on global migrations. We established that states in all continents are experiencing migration, ascending receiving, transit, and return sites. The largest international corridors of human movement are unfolding in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. We further establish that international migration within nation states is also on the rise. Asia, again, leads the way. Combined, the numbers of international and internal migrants today is more than 1 billion people. The world over, immigrants and refugees are arousing distrust, fear, and xenophobia. We're witnessing the emergence of a class of politicians very adept at addressing their reptilian brain, the centers of fear, of hate, of xenophobia. Immigration is the frontier pushing against the limits of Christian tolerance, charity in the modernist nation state. Immigration intensifies the general crisis of connection and flight from the pursuit of our inherent humanitarian obligations to the welfare of others. I will finish now. In the 21st century, migration while there are proof points of humanitarian excellence the world over, we must redouble our efforts to confront the crisis ongoing in our world today. Thank you.